Hello, everyone, and here are the details of today's video: Trump's decision to tighten immigration after the Washington, D.C. shootings. I see less as a targeted policy response than as a reflection of a broader political instinct to reduce complex social crises to simple emotional explanations. In moments of violence, political leaders often feel compelled to provide clarity, even when the real causes lie in layers of structural chaos. Trump has chosen immigration as his explanatory framework, claiming that the incident reflects an uncontrolled border. But in my view, this interpretation tells us more about the politics of fear than about the nature of violence. The United States is suffering from a persistent epidemic of mass shootings, and I have observed these tragedies occurring during periods of both high and low immigration. They do not originate from a single source, but from a social environment riven by social isolation, political polarization, widespread access to guns, and weakened public institutions. When you look at the data, it is clear that most of the shooters were born in the United States, acting within a domestic ecosystem of despair and division. Attributing the violence primarily to immigration ignores the inherent weaknesses in American society. Trump's narrative, however, fits a familiar pattern. By attributing the shootings to border failures, he has transformed a complex domestic tragedy into a narrative of external threat. This resonates politically because it provides a sense of order. An outside force has caused suffering, and stronger borders will restore security. Its rhetorical power lies in its simplicity. People facing violence often look for someone to blame, and immigrants become an accessible figure in the national imagination. But this narrative, I argue, distorts structural realities, diverting attention from the deeper social failures that have allowed mass violence to become commonplace. The deeper causes are deeply internal: economic insecurity, erosion of community cohesion, declining mental health, and a breakdown in institutional trust make up the very fabric of America's vulnerability. These forces create an environment conducive to acts of violence, regardless of immigration flows. But addressing them requires a long-term rebuilding of social infrastructure, a task far more difficult than invoking border control. Trump's response also operates within the symbolic politics of national identity. Immigration, in his terms, becomes a metaphor for instability itself. By tightening immigration in response to the shooting, he positioned himself as reasserting control over a country he described as in danger. The move was not so much aimed at specific perpetrators as it was a show of assertive power at a time of public anxiety. In my view, the shooting in Washington, D.C. was a symptom of a deeper systemic malaise, not simply a product of poor border management. Focusing solely on immigration misdiagnoses the crisis and risks, perpetuating the very conditions that allow violence to thrive. When I reflect on Trump's response tightening immigration immediately after the D.C. shooting, I see a pattern that extends far beyond this single event. Immigration has become, in American politics, a potent symbolic arena where deeper anxieties about national identity, security, and social cohesion are projected. Trump's decision fits neatly into this dynamic. Instead of addressing the multidimensional causes of violence, social breakdown, mental health collapse, economic precarity, he places immigration at the center, not because it is the most accurate explanation, but because it is the most politically advantageous one. From my perspective, immigration serves as a kind of political pressure point. It is easier to blame what appears foreign or external than to confront the domestic failures that accumulate inside the country: an underfunded mental health system, a fragmented social fabric, and decades of political unwillingness to regulate firearms. When Trump claims that the DC shooting illustrates the consequences of uncontrolled borders, he is not simply giving an analysis, he is activating a narrative that has been central to his political identity. Immigration becomes the canvas onto which he paints the story of American decline and the restoration he promises. This strategy is effective because it simplifies the immigration system with all its complexities: visa policies, asylum processes, labor dynamics, can be reduced rhetorically to a single failing border. By tightening immigration in the aftermath of a violent incident, Trump offers what seems like a direct and forceful response. This approach appeals to a public that has grown increasingly distrustful of institutions and deeply fatigued by social instability. Many Americans feel that the country is drifting without control, and immigration becomes a convenient symbol of that drift. But I also recognize that this response avoids the deeper structural issues. Mass shootings in the United States are overwhelmingly a result of internal conditions: the cultural normalization of violence, the easy availability of firearms, the failure to invest in community-level support systems. These are domestic failures. Yet these areas require careful policy-making, compromise, and long-term commitment, none of which align neatly with the fast, dramatic gestures that dominate modern political communication. By focusing on immigration, Trump leverages a narrative that reinforces his political brand: the outsider who restores order by confronting threats that other leaders refuse to acknowledge. This narrative allows him to sidestep the more difficult conversation about America's systemic vulnerabilities. Instead of addressing inequality, mental health crises, and institutional erosion, he places the emphasis on border enforcement, a domain he can easily dramatize and weaponize politically. In my view, this use of immigration as a scapegoat reveals a deeper failure of governance. The country lacks a functioning consensus on how to respond to violence or how to rebuild social infrastructure. Political leaders reach for symbolic gestures because the system no longer produces coherent, long-term solutions. Trump's tightening of immigration, therefore, is not a genuine response to the DC shooting. It is a strategic move within a fragmented political landscape, one that relies on simplification rather than structural diagnosis. Mass shootings in the United States, it became clear to me that the incident in Washington, D.C. cannot be explained by immigration alone. What we are witnessing is the result of a deep malaise within the country, an internal division that has built up over decades. I see a society experiencing deep social tensions. Communities are fragmenting, trust in institutions has collapsed, and public systems have eroded. These internal conditions create an environment where violence has become disturbingly common. In my analysis, the United States faces a unique combination of structural weaknesses. First and most obvious is the extraordinary availability of guns. No other advanced economy allows such widespread and often unregulated access to weapons capable of causing mass casualties. This structural reality turns individual grievances into deadly consequences. Regardless of immigration, a society with a proliferation of guns will remain vulnerable to sudden outbreaks of violence. The Washington, D.C. shooting, tragic as it was, fits this pattern, but guns alone cannot explain the whole picture. I see a deeper psychological and social breakdown. Economic inequality has spread to levels not seen in generations, creating a wave of despair and alienation. Millions feel excluded from economic opportunity, trapped in precarious employment, or burdened with debt. This economic pressure breeds resentment and hopelessness, conditions that can exacerbate personal malaise. At the same time, the country's mental health system is severely underfunded and fragmented. For many Americans, seeking treatment is impossible or unaffordable due to systemic barriers. Untreated psychological distress becomes fertile ground for impulsive or violent behavior. In a healthier society, these individuals would receive support before they reach a breaking point. In today's reality, intervention often occurs only after tragedy has occurred. The erosion of community institutions exacerbates the problem. Over the years, I have witnessed churches, community centers, local associations, and public spaces lose their role as social stabilizers. Without these community anchors, individuals become more isolated, invisible, and disconnected from shared norms. Social fragmentation weakens informal networks that can identify early warning signs or provide emotional support. Political polarization has also accelerated the process of violence. In recent years, rhetoric across the political spectrum has become more strident, angry, and accusatory. Some individuals internalize this rhetoric as a justification for aggression. The line between political conflict and personal grievances blurs, allowing the unsettled to view violence as an extension of their ideological struggles. When Trump attributes the Washington, D.C. shooting to immigration, I see a narrative that avoids these internal failures. It responds to fear but fails to diagnose or address the root causes. Immigration becomes an easy explanation because it comes from the outside. Internal turmoil requires us to look inward to confront long-standing structural decay. In my view, America's crisis is fundamentally internal. No border policy, no matter how strict or lenient, can address the problems that arise from inequality, institutional neglect, declining mental health, and widespread access to guns. The Washington, D.C. shooting, it is not a matter of foreign intrusion into the country. It is an internal problem that has been allowed to develop within the country. When I hear political leaders invoke terrorism after a domestic shooting, I immediately understand that we are entering a space where fear and political expediency intersect. After the Washington, D.C. shooting, there were hints, some subtle and some explicit, that foreign-sponsored terrorism might be behind the violence. In my view, this narrative serves as a political tool rather than an evidence-based assessment. Most mass shootings in the United States are not linked to international terrorist networks. They are rooted in domestic unrest. Yet the terrorism framework persists because it allows leaders to turn a deep internal crisis into an external threat, one that seems more manageable, more preventable, and more amenable to a strong political response. I recognize that terrorism is a powerful concept in American political culture. It conjures up images of coordinated conspiracies, ideological enemies, and foreign infiltration. By linking a domestic shooting to terrorism, even vaguely, political leaders gain rhetorical freedom to justify comprehensive security measures. This framing allows for expanded surveillance, tighter border controls, and expanded executive power. It shifts focus away from structural failures at home and reframes the problem as a defense issue. This has political value because it positions the crisis outside the nation's own social structure. When Trump links the Washington, D.C. shooting to possible foreign sponsorship or says it might be terrorism, he is not primarily making an analytical argument. He is deploying a strategic narrative. He connects the tragedy to immigration, weak borders, and geopolitical threats, conflating domestic insecurity with foreign danger. This simplification of the story has a powerful emotional appeal. It turns a messy, multidimensional problem rooted in inequality, gun access, and psychological breakdown into a single narrative. America is under attack from abroad, and stronger borders will protect it. But when I study patterns of violence in the United States, I see a reality that is radically different from this narrative. The vast majority of mass shooters act alone, without foreign direction or support. Their motivations are personal, psychological, ideological, or rooted in domestic grievances. By labeling these acts as terrorism, political leaders distort the underlying forces driving violence in America and distract from the urgent need to rebuild social cohesion and mental health infrastructure. At the same time, I understand why the terrorism rhetoric persists. It is politically profitable. It provides drama, clarity, and moral certainty. It allows leaders to sidestep difficult debates about gun regulation, economic inequality, fraying community institutions, and the mental health system. Instead of confronting a domestic crisis that requires long-term investment and bipartisan cooperation, they instead use rhetoric that quickly reinforces existing political identities. In my view, this exploitation of terrorism rhetoric reflects a larger failure of governance. Instead of addressing the systemic roots of violence, leaders turn to rhetoric that justifies security-first approaches and portrays domestic unrest as foreign intrusion. The danger is that such rhetoric produces powerful but ineffective policy responses that expand police and border enforcement without strengthening the social foundations needed to prevent violence. Ultimately, when terrorism is invoked without evidence, the country is further removed from understanding its own internal fragility. The real threat is not an external force infiltrating American society. It is the unresolved internal dysfunction that allows such tragedies to continue. When I consider what Trump and his administration would actually implement in response to the D.C. shooting, I see a policy trajectory centered overwhelmingly on enforcement, surveillance, and border restriction. These measures fit neatly into Trump's long-standing political narrative: security restored through strength, order restored through force, and stability restored through limitation. Yet from my perspective, these approaches, while politically resonant, fail to address the underlying structural causes of violence in the United States. If Trump tightens immigration further, I expect he will expand border wall construction, reimpose strict asylum barriers, and significantly reduce refugee admissions. He would likely reinstate or intensify policies aimed at accelerating deportations, increasing detention capacity, and pressuring local jurisdictions to cooperate with federal immigration enforcement. These measures provide a clear image of governmental action, but they are not designed to address domestic drivers of violence. Instead, they reaffirm the narrative that America's insecurity is imported, not homegrown. I also anticipate a resurgence of federal-state policing partnerships, including expanded authority for ICE, enhanced intelligence sharing, and more aggressive surveillance of immigrant communities. To Trump, these illustrate proactive governance. To me, they represent a security-first framework that risks stigmatizing entire populations without meaningfully reducing the likelihood of mass violence. Most shootings originate not from immigration flows, but from internal disorder, and these policies do little to heal that disorder. To address shootings more directly, I suspect Trump would prioritize a federal crackdown on gangs, cartels, and transnational criminal networks, areas where decisive action is politically popular. He may expand federal gun task forces, increase funding for law enforcement, and promote doctrines that emphasize law and order over social investment. These steps respond to public fear, but they avoid confronting the real sources of instability: mental health breakdown, economic inequality, firearms accessibility, and the gradual collapse of social infrastructure. What stands out to me is the imbalance between symbolic responses and structural solutions. Enforcement can create the appearance of immediate action, but it does not rebuild institutions that have withered. It does not expand mental health care, address poverty, or strengthen community networks. These are the pillars that actually prevent violence, yet they receive far less political attention because they lack dramatic impact. They require long-term coordination and public investment, areas where contemporary American politics struggles the most. I also foresee broader consequences. A security-first approach may deepen polarization, erode trust between immigrant communities and authorities, and expand executive power in ways that outlast any specific crisis. It may also divert resources away from essential social programs that would tackle the root causes of violence. To me, this is a fundamental risk. By treating shootings as failures of immigration rather than failures of domestic policy, the nation drifts further from understanding its own internal fragility. In the end, if Trump responds with enforcement alone, the country will see action but not resolution. Without structural reforms, economic, social, and institutional, America will remain vulnerable, not because of what comes from outside, but because of what is left unaddressed within